A demi-tasse cup slid across white linen and stopped 6 inches from his folded hands. No saucer rattle. No steam. The cup was cold to the touch, and that was the point. The woman who set it down did not bow her head. She did not back away from him. She stood at the corner of the booth where she had stood every Tuesday night for 31 years, and she spoke one sentence so quietly that only the 3 men at the back wall heard it. The bodyguard near the door felt the temperature drop without knowing why. The pianist missed a key. The chandelier above the booth swung half an inch on its chain and kept swinging. The man across from her did not lift the cup. He looked at it the way a soldier looks at a grenade with a missing pin. Stay with me on this one. The restaurant sat on a corner of Mulberry Street, where the awning had been the same faded green since the second Reagan administration. 3 windows on the street, a hand-painted sign with a chipped letter, and a brass bell over the door that had not been polished since the woman who owned the place stopped caring what tourists thought of brass. The kitchen sent out the same 11 dishes it had been sending out since the 70s. The wine list was 1 page, and the only printed item on it was the disclaimer at the bottom that said cash only. The booths along the back wall were upholstered in cracked oxblood leather, and the booth in the farthest corner, closest to the kitchen door and the alley exit, was reserved every Tuesday night from 8 until 11 for a party of 3. The reservation had been on the books since 1994. No one had ever needed to renew it. The owner was a woman named Rosa Marconi, and on Tuesday nights she did not let the waiters serve the back corner booth. She carried the bread basket herself. She brought the carafe of red wine and the small bowl of olive oil and the plate of cured ham with shaved fennel. She set the coffee cups on the marble side cart and waited for the signal from the man in the middle of the 3. When he raised his index finger, she poured the espresso from a copper pot, and she carried it to the booth on a silver tray with a folded napkin under her wrist. She had done this every Tuesday for 31 years. She had never once spilled. She had never once spoken a sentence longer than 3 words at the table. She had never once looked the man in the middle directly in the eyes for longer than half a second. Until tonight. She was 69 years old, and her hair was pinned in a low silver knot that had not changed shape since her husband died in 2001. She wore a black cotton dress with a thin white collar and a small gold cross at her throat that her mother had given her at her first communion. She walked with a slight favor of her right hip. She did not own a cell phone. She balanced the books by hand in a green ledger she kept in a locked drawer under the host stand. She lived in the apartment above the restaurant. 2 rooms and a galley kitchen. A small balcony that overlooked the alley. A framed photograph on her nightstand of a young man in a marine dress uniform who had been her brother and who had been dead since the spring of 1971. The man in the middle of the booth was named Don Salvatore Romano. He was 74. He had 3 children, 6 grandchildren, 2 operating soldiers who carried his messages, 1 consigliere who carried his thinking, and an annual income that the federal government estimated at 0. He had walked into the restaurant for the first time in the autumn of 1994 because his consigliere had told him the food was good and the owner was discreet, and he had returned every Tuesday for 31 years because the consigliere had been right on both counts. He liked the back corner booth because it had 2 exits and a clean line of sight to the front door. He liked the espresso because it was always hot enough to burn the roof of his mouth. He liked Rosa Marconi because she never asked questions, never lingered at the table, and had never given him a reason to remember her name on the drive home. He had an older brother once. Giancarlo Romano had been the heir apparent in 1971, the favorite son, the one with the colder eye and the harder hand. Giancarlo had disappeared in April of that year. The official family position, established within 48 hours of the disappearance and never revised, was that Giancarlo had been taken by a rival crew from Bensonhurst over a dispute about a longshoreman's local. That rival crew had been quietly erased over the following 18 months, 1 funeral at a time. Giancarlo's body had never been recovered. His mother had gone to her grave in 1989, still lighting a candle for him every Sunday. His father had gone to his grave in 1991 without ever speaking his name aloud again. Salvatore, who had been 20 years old in 1971, had inherited the chair and the ring and the booth, and he had not allowed himself to think about his brother in any sustained way for 34 years. He had simply assumed that the version of the story he had been told was the version that was true. On this particular Tuesday night in late October, the air outside the restaurant smelled of wet leaves and roasted chestnuts. The Don arrived at 7:58, 3 minutes early. He was accompanied by his consigliere, a thin man named Vito Pellegrino, who wore the same brown overcoat in every weather, and by a younger soldier named Marco, who had recently been moved up from driver to bodyguard. Rosa met them at the door. She took the Don's overcoat. She hung it on the third hook from the left. She walked them to the back corner booth and laid out 3 menus that none of them would open. She brought the bread, the wine, the oil, the ham. The Don asked after her health in 2 words. She answered in 3. The exchange had not varied in 3 decades. The kitchen was busy that night. A party of 12 in the front room celebrating a christening. A regular at table 4 who had ordered the ossobuco. A young couple by the window arguing in low voices about whether to move to New Jersey. The chef, Aldo, had been with Rosa since 1988, and he was working the line with 2 cooks under him. The pianist, an old man named Tony, was working his way through a slow version of an old standard. The clock above the host stand read 8:47. The Don raised his index finger. Rosa walked to the marble side cart. She lifted the small copper pot. She poured the espresso into the demitasse cup, the way she had poured it 943 times before. She set the cup on the silver tray. She folded the white napkin under her wrist. She walked the 4 short steps to the booth. She set the tray on the edge of the table. She lifted the cup with the back of her left hand pressed lightly to the saucer, the way her grandmother had taught her to serve coffee in 1962, and she slid the cup across the linen until it stopped 6 inches from the Don's folded hands. But the cup was cold. Not lukewarm. Not cooling. Cold the way the marble counter was cold, the way the cellar floor was cold in February, the way the iron handle of the alley door was cold at the end of a long night. The espresso inside was cold the way a thing is cold when it has been pulled from a refrigerator and not from a copper pot. The Don did not move. The consigliere, who had been mid-sentence about a meeting on Thursday, stopped talking. The young soldier, who had been watching the front door, turned his head 1 degree. Rosa did not back away. She straightened her right hip. She placed her hands flat on the edge of the table, palms down, the way a person places hands when she has decided not to leave the room. And she spoke 1 sentence so quietly that only the 3 men at the back wall heard it. She said, "Drink it, Capo. I buried your brother." The pianist missed a key. The chandelier above the booth moved half an inch on its chain. The young soldier put his hand inside his jacket without thinking, and then took it out again, because he did not know what he would have done with it. The consigliere went very still in the way that thin men go still when they are calculating 34 years of accounts in 3 seconds. The Don did not lift the cup. He did not lift his eyes. He looked at the demitasse on the white linen as if it had a fuse, and he understood, in the same instant that any man at his level understands these things, that the woman who had served him espresso every Tuesday for 31 years had just become the most important person in his life. He did not know yet whether the most important person in his life was someone he needed to protect or someone he needed to bury. He needed information he did not have. He needed time he could not buy at the table. He drew a breath that was longer than the breath of a man who is afraid, and shorter than the breath of a man who is in control, and he raised 1 finger to the consigliere without taking his eyes off the cup. Vito Pellegrino slid out of the booth and walked to the front door, and turned the brass sign from open to closed. He locked the deadbolt. He pulled the shade. He spoke 2 quiet words to the bartender, and she walked to the kitchen and spoke 2 quiet words to Aldo. Aldo wiped his hands on the dish towel at his belt. He told the cooks to take their break in the alley. He walked out to the front room and asked the party of 12, very politely, if they would mind moving the celebration to the sister restaurant 2 blocks east, where the owner would be honored to host them at no charge. The regular at table 4 was offered a complimentary cab home. The young couple by the window was given 2 bottles of Barolo and a similar suggestion. Within 11 minutes, the only people left in Sapor Vecchio were Rosa, the Don, the consigliere, the soldier, and Tony the pianist, who was discreet enough that no one had asked him to leave. Tony closed the lid on his piano and folded his hands in his lap and looked at the floor. If you're still with me, hit that subscribe button. The Don finally lifted his eyes from the cold cup. He looked at Rosa Marconi for the first time in 31 years, the way a man looks at a person and not a piece of furniture. He saw a small woman in a black cotton dress with a thin white collar and a gold cross at her throat. He saw the silver knot of her hair and the slight favor of her right hip. He saw the lines at the corners of her mouth that had been carved by 31 years of not speaking. He saw, behind all of that, a face he had not allowed himself to remember. A face from a kitchen in the spring of 1971, in a small town in the hills above the Tappan Zee, where his brother Giancarlo had gone to settle a private matter that had nothing to do with the family business, and that no one in the family had ever been told about. The Don's mouth went dry. He understood, before she said another word, that the woman across the table had not been hired by Sapor Vecchio in 1988. She had bought Sapor Vecchio in 1988. She had bought it on purpose. She had bought it because his consigliere ate there. She had waited 37 years to slide a cold cup across a white linen tablecloth, and she had chosen the cup the way other people choose a coffin. He asked her, in a voice that did not sound like his own, to sit down. She did not sit. She turned the demi-tasse cup 3/4 of an inch clockwise on the linen, the way a person turns a key, and she said, "I will stand. I have been standing for 37 years. You can stand with me for the next hour or you can sit, but you will listen." The consigliere, who had returned to the booth, raised one hand to the Don for permission to speak. The Don gave him no signal. The consigliere lowered his hand. The young soldier Marco had been instructed, with a glance, to stand by the kitchen door and to put his hands in his pockets and to leave them there. Tony, the pianist, had not lifted his head from his lap. Although the chef stood behind the swinging kitchen door with one hand on the frame, and through the small round window in the door, he watched his employer the way a son watches a mother on a hospital bed. Rosa Marconi placed both of her hands on the back of the empty chair across from the Don. She did not look at the consigliere. She did not look at the soldier. She looked at Salvatore Romano, and she began to speak, and her voice did not shake. She told him that her name had not always been Marconi. She had been born Rosaria Conti in a village in Calabria in 1956, and she had come to the United States in 1968 with her mother and her brother Antonio, the boy in the marine dress uniform on her nightstand. Antonio had taken work as a driver for a man who ran a small import business out of a warehouse on the Hudson. That man had been a friend of Giancarlo Romano. In the spring of 1971, Antonio had been asked by Giancarlo to drive him north on a Wednesday afternoon to a farmhouse in the hills above the Tappan Zee. He had been told the trip would take 4 hours and that he would be paid $200 in cash. He had been 15 years old. He had lied about his age on the chauffeur's license. He had not told his mother where he was going. He had not told his sister Rosaria, who was 8 years old and waiting on the front step of the apartment with a paper bag of chestnuts. Antonio had not come home. The farmhouse, Rosa explained, had belonged to a woman named Caterina Falcone, who had been Giancarlo's lover for 2 years and who had been pregnant with his child for 7 months. Giancarlo had driven up that Wednesday to end the relationship and to deliver an envelope of cash and to arrange for the child to be raised in another state under another name. Caterina had not accepted the envelope. Caterina had a brother named Pasquale Falcone, and Pasquale had been waiting in the barn behind the farmhouse with a hunting rifle and 2 cousins from New Jersey. There had been an argument in the kitchen that had lasted 11 minutes. There had been a gunshot. A second gunshot. A long silence. And then the sound of Pasquale Falcone walking across the gravel drive to the black sedan parked at the edge of the road, where a 15-year-old boy named Antonio Conti was sitting behind the wheel with the window cracked, smoking a cigarette he had stolen from his mother's purse. Rosa told the Don, in a voice that was steady the way a stone is steady, that Antonio had seen Pasquale come out of the house. Antonio had seen Pasquale's two cousins drag a body wrapped in a green wool blanket out of the kitchen door. Antonio had seen them load the body into the trunk of the sedan. Antonio had tried to start the car. Antonio had not been fast enough. Pasquale Falcone had put the barrel of the hunting rifle against the window glass on the driver's side, and he had said 3 words to a 15-year-old boy that Rosa Marconi would learn, 22 years later, when she finally got Caterina Falcone drunk enough in a kitchen in Pennsylvania to tell her exactly what had happened in the spring of 1971. Pasquale had said, "You drive north." Antonio had driven north for 2 hours into the foothills of the Catskills. Pasquale had ridden beside him with the rifle across his lap. The two cousins had followed in a second car. They had stopped at a clearing at the end of a logging road that did not appear on any state map. They had made Antonio dig 2 holes. The first hole had been for Giancarlo Romano. The second hole had been for Antonio Conti. And then, Rosa said, something had happened that Pasquale Falcone had not planned. The two cousins from New Jersey had refused to shoot a 15-year-old boy. There had been an argument in the clearing that had lasted 19 minutes. The cousins had won. Antonio had been driven home. Antonio had been told, in a voice that was steady the way a knife is steady, that if he ever told anyone in his life what he had seen in those hills, his mother and his sister would be found at the bottom of the East River within the week. Antonio had been let out 3 blocks from his apartment. He had walked the 3 blocks. He had gone upstairs. He had washed his face in the kitchen sink. He had not spoken to his mother or his sister for the rest of that day. He had eaten dinner with them in silence. He had gone to bed early. And in the morning, Rosa said, Antonio had enlisted in the United States Marine Corps under a forged date of birth, and 4 months later he had been on a transport plane to a country he could not have found on a map. He had been killed in Quang Tri Province in the fall of 1971. He had been 16 years old. He had never told their mother what he had seen in those hills. He had told only one person in his life, and that person had been his 8-year-old sister Rosaria, on the night before he left for basic training, in a whispered conversation on a fire escape above an alley in the Lower East Side, because he had needed at least one person in the world to know where Giancarlo Romano was buried. He had drawn her a map on the back of a paper napkin. He had made her memorize the landmarks. He had made her burn the napkin in a coffee can on the fire escape. He had made her swear, on the medal of St. Christopher around her neck, that she would never speak the location aloud until the day she could speak it to the right person in the right room at the right moment. It had taken her 37 years to find the right room. Rosa took the cold demi-tasse cup from in front of the Don. She set it carefully on the silver tray. She produced, from the pocket of her black cotton dress, a small folded square of yellowed paper. She set the paper on the white linen tablecloth between them. She did not unfold it. She told him that the paper contained a hand-drawn map in her own 8-year-old handwriting, redrawn from memory 3 days after Antonio had burned the original, hidden inside the lining of her first communion missal for 37 years, and that the map showed the precise location of a clearing at the end of a logging road in the foothills of the Catskills, where his older brother had been buried in a green wool blanket on a Wednesday night in April of 1971. She told him that the man who had buried Giancarlo, Pasquale Falcone, was still alive. He was 81 years old. He lived in a retirement community in Boca Raton under his wife's maiden name. He played bocce on Tuesdays. He had a daughter who was a real estate agent, and a son who was a dentist, and a grandson who was a freshman at the University of Florida. She told him the address of the retirement community. She told him the name on the mailbox. She told him the make and color of the car parked in the assigned space. She had not, she said, gone there herself. She had only watched. She had only waited. because the killing of Pascual Falcone, she said, was not her killing to do. Her brother Antonio had not been killed by Pascual Falcone. Her brother Antonio had been killed by the war that the Romano family had asked him to drive into without ever asking his name. She placed her right hand on top of the folded square of yellowed paper. She did not slide it across the table. She said, "The map is yours when you understand what you are buying. You are buying the location of your brother. You are buying the name of the man who killed him. You are buying the chance to bring your brother home to your mother's grave, which is something your father went to his grave without being able to do. And in exchange, you are giving me 3 things. The first thing is the truth, spoken aloud in this room, in front of the chef who has stood at my side for 37 years, that the version of the story your family has told itself since 1971 was a lie. The second thing is your word, spoken on the medal of St. Christopher around my neck, which was my brother's medal, that no one in your family will ever again ask a 15-year-old boy to drive a car he does not understand. The third thing is your hand, across this table, in the presence of these witnesses, given to me as a sister and not as a customer, for as long as either of us is alive. Those are the terms. You can drink the cup, or you can leave the cup. But you cannot have the map without the terms." The Don sat in the booth for a long time. The consigliere did not speak. The young soldier did not move. The pianist did not look up. The chef Aldo stepped through the swinging kitchen door and walked the length of the front room and stood 3 feet behind Rosa with his arms folded across his apron, and he did not say a word, but his presence was a sentence longer than any sentence anyone had spoken that night. The Don looked at the cold cup. He looked at the folded square of yellowed paper. He looked at the woman in the black cotton dress with the gold cross at her throat. He thought about his mother lighting a candle every Sunday from 1971 until 1989 for a son she could not bury. He thought about his father going to his grave in 1991 with the name of his firstborn unspoken on his lips for 18 years. He thought about his own 3 children and his 6 grandchildren and the chair and the ring and the booth and the 31 Tuesdays he had spent across a table from a woman whose name he had not bothered to remember. He thought about a 15-year-old boy in a stolen cigarette on a spring night in 1971 who had driven north into a clearing because someone in his family had asked him to. He reached across the white linen tablecloth. He did not take the map. He took her hand. He held it for a count of 7. He said, in a voice that did not belong to a Don, that belonged instead to a younger brother who had been waiting for 34 years to find out where his older brother was sleeping, the 3 sentences she had asked him to say. He said them in the order she had asked. He said them clearly enough that the chef heard them. He said them clearly enough that the consigliere wrote them down on the back of a business card with a small silver pen, because the consigliere understood, the way thin men understand these things, that a contract had just been signed at his table that would govern the next 20 years of the family's life. Rosa slid the folded square of yellowed paper across the linen. She did not unfold it for him. She left that to him. She turned away from the booth. She walked the 4 steps back to the marble side cart. She lifted the silver tray with the cold demitasse cup. She carried it through the swinging kitchen door. She set the cup in the deep stainless sink. She rinsed it under the tap. She dried it with a clean white towel. She placed it back on the shelf where it had lived for 31 years. And then she sat down on the small wooden stool in the corner of the kitchen, the stool where she had sat to peel potatoes since 1988, and she allowed herself, for the first time in 37 years, to cry the way a sister cries for a brother who has been dead since she was 8 years old. In the front room, the Don unfolded the yellowed paper. He looked at the child's handwriting and the careful pencil marks, and the small drawing of a tree with a forked branch that an 8-year-old girl had memorized on a fire escape on the night before her brother left for a war he would not survive. He folded the paper. He put it in the inside pocket of his jacket, against his chest. He stood up from the booth. He walked through the swinging kitchen door, past Aldo who stepped aside without a word, and he crossed the small kitchen to the wooden stool in the corner, where a 69-year-old woman in a black cotton dress was crying with both hands pressed flat against her thighs. He knelt down on the linoleum floor in his tailored suit. He put both of his hands on top of her hands. He said her brother's name aloud. He said Antonio Conti. He said it twice. He said it the way a man says a name when he is asking the dead to forgive him for 34 years of not knowing it. And Rosa Marconi lowered her forehead to the top of the Don's hands and stayed there until Aldo turned off the overhead light in the kitchen, and the only thing illuminating the corner was the small red bulb above the stove that had not been changed since the year her husband died. The Don stood up. He walked back through the swinging door. He took down his overcoat from the third hook from the left. He did not speak to the consigliere or the young soldier. He walked out into the wet October air on Mulberry Street, and he stood for a moment under the faded green awning and looked up at the apartment window above the restaurant where a single lamp was burning, and he understood that the most powerful person in his family was not, and had never been, the man in the back corner booth. The most powerful person in his family was the small woman in the black cotton dress who had decided, 3 days after her brother whispered a map to her on a fire escape in 1971, that she would wait. She would wait through her mother's death. She would wait through her own husband's funeral. She would wait through 31 Tuesdays a year for 31 years, and she would wait through 943 cups of espresso poured from a copper pot, until the night she decided to pour the 944th from the refrigerator instead. And she would slide it 6 inches across a white linen tablecloth, and the temperature of the entire family would change. Because in the end, the only weapon a sister had ever needed was patience. And in the end, the only debt a Don had ever truly owed was to a 15-year-old boy with a stolen cigarette who had driven north on a Wednesday afternoon in the spring of 1971, because someone, in a family that had never bothered to learn his name, had asked him to. Inside the restaurant, the chef Aldo turned the deadbolt on the front door. He turned off the chandelier above the back corner booth. He helped Rosa stand up from the wooden stool. He walked her up the narrow stairs to the apartment above the restaurant. He set a kettle on the stove. He poured her a small glass of grappa. He sat with her at her kitchen table until she finished it. And then he went back downstairs and finished closing the restaurant the way he had finished closing it every Tuesday night for 37 years. Because some debts, he understood, were paid in espresso, and some debts were paid in the quiet labor of staying near a person who had carried a thing too heavy alone for far too long. The brass bell rang once when he locked it from the outside. The lamp in the upstairs window stayed on until almost dawn. And on a small nightstand above a restaurant on Mulberry Street, a framed photograph of a young man in a marine dress uniform was finally, after 54 years, no longer the only person in the room who knew where Giancarlo Romano had been buried.